So we are back in John chapter 18, and we're looking into, well, the last part of the betrayals of Jesus. This is also interspersed with the trial of Jesus. Um, the trial before the high priest. And as I was talking about last time, there's not exactly a discrepancy, but a little bit of a disagreement between John and the other Gospels. And that could be like, oh no, does that mean there's error in the Bible? No. John's basically pointing out that Annas, uh, because Jesus is being tried by Annas here, Annas is a far more legitimate high priest than Caiaphas, even though Caiaphas is serving as the high priest at this point in time. So there's the trial that John is really focused on, and that's with Annas. And then there's also the betrayal of Peter that we were looking at last time, but before that, the betrayal of Jesus. So for today, we're going to be getting into the discussion between Jesus and Annas, and hopefully we'll also get to the last bits of Peter's betrayal, but we'll see how we progress. All right, so let's get into the text itself. So we got through the first trial. So we're with the high priest. So could somebody please read John chapter 18, verses 19 to 24.
Meanwhile, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. I have spoken openly to the world, Jesus replied. I always taught in synagogues or at the temple, where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. Why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. When Jesus said this, one of the officials nearly struck him in the face. Is this the way you answer the high priest? He demanded. If I said something wrong, Jesus replied, testify as to what is wrong. But if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? Then Annas sent him, still bound, to Caiaphas, the high priest.
Alrighty. Yes, so we have verse 19 there, just taking place more or less as Peter is betraying Jesus the first time. So that's the few verses beforehand where Peter is denying that he knows Jesus as Jesus is being set in front of Annas. But we don't have Annas's name being declared outright in verse 19, just as the high priest. But from context, when you read verse 24, like, then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas the high priest. So obviously this high priest is Annas himself. So John is pointing that out, that he considers Annas the high priest. Did you want me to just very briefly cover that again, or are you good? Okay. Yeah. All right, so Jesus, he's being questioned about the disciples and his teaching. Confusing. Okay. So Jesus is going to not exactly object to this, but point out this isn't normally how things are done. And he's hinting about it in a couple different ways. So when Jesus replies in verse 20, he is saying, I spoke openly to the world. Okay, so open there does have a number of different meanings. And it comes up in a few different places in the Gospel of John. And yes, it has multiple meanings in the Gospel of John, sometimes at the same time. Because John. So the word for openly can just mean, say, like in plain sight. So yeah, this is very public. But it could also mean boldly, confidently, or just being open and forthright. So Jesus is most likely using a double entendre where he's saying that he has spoken boldly and confidently before. So if they're questioning about his teaching, he's not backing down on this. He's like, I spoke this. I definitely spoke confidently, boldly. I spoke it out. But he's also having the other meaning of publicly, that he spoke this in public, so everybody should be able to testify to it.
And that goes back to the Jewish court system too. Bring a couple witnesses to
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's why in the next part, he's saying, why are you questioning me? Shouldn't you be questioning the other people? Because it is about having 2 or 3 witnesses. Especially if we're talking about possibly putting Jesus to death, because you need 2 or 3 witnesses to put somebody to death. For some other relatively trivial matters, you only need, say, like 1 witness. But for this, to put somebody to death, you need more witnesses. So Jesus is kind of poking a hole in the whole trial and showcasing that this isn't exactly a legitimate trial. So for a trial, do you just want the high priest there, or do you want the whole Sanhedrin? Do you want like 1 judge, or do you want more of a court system with all the priests? Well, maybe not all the priests, but a representative proportion of the priests.
It's required to have them all there, isn't it?
Yeah, it's required to have a representation of the Sanhedrin there. Annas is also not currently serving as the high priest. So this is very interesting. Where this is an informal trial, and they're basically seeking to kill him. So this is one of the reasons why some scholars will think that the Gospels are fake, is because they will show that there's malfeasance in terms of the judicial system in this case. They go like, well, the Sanhedrin can never make a kangaroo court and use trumped up charges, or just think of like no court system anywhere would ever go against its own rules. Yeah.
Pastor, the fact that when this was done, was it in night? Was that common? That court was held at night?
Absolutely not.
Right.
This should not be going on at all. It should actually be in daybreak. This is also why, as I was reading through at least 1 commentator, he was talking about how some of the other commentators were looking at this and going like, oh, well, the Gospels probably got the time wrong because this shouldn't be at night, or the time stamps that John gives, and he gives one a little bit later on in verse 28 there, where he says, it was early when Jesus was brought to Pilate. So they take that timestamp as, oh, well, that's just a general time frame, so it must have been kind of later on in the morning, because it must have been at least daybreak when Jesus was tried. Which, no, that's not what any of the gospel writers have said. Actually, there was one person that he was quoting who was trying to make the case that they actually arrested Jesus on Wednesday, and all the trials were above board and happening on Thursday in broad daylight, and then they killed him on Friday. No. Usually when you find somebody who's going against all historical documentation like that, they're just nuts, and they're trying to exonerate people who should not be exonerated for their evil deeds. Oh. So, yeah, there's a whole bunch of things going on that signals that this is wrong. Now, Jesus, he's kind of showing that this is the exact opposite of what Annas is doing. So Jesus says, like, I spoke openly to the world. I've always taught in synagogues or at the temple. Okay. So do you remember where Jesus is right now?
Caiaphas' residence?
Yes, you have a private residence. Why would you have a public trial at a private residence? Hmm.
Unprecedented.
Yeah. You might also remember with the man born blind in John chapter 9, like he was brought to the people twice, and then his parents once, so there was three trials there. And for these three cases, it was always at the synagogue. So a synagogue could actually be a location where you make these sorts of decisions. Like if you're talking about at least excommunication, well, the synagogue would make sense of the place where you would excommunicate somebody. The temple would be the primary place that you would be doing that, if you would like to do it there. But the temple, for say something as serious as death sentence, yes, you would definitely be doing it at the temple. I don't know if that would actually occur at a synagogue. I'm not absolutely certain, but you at least want to have it at the temple. So Jesus is contrasting what he's doing, where he's saying, I was in the synagogues, I was in the temple, I was saying these things, I wasn't tried or killed there. But guess where we are in the middle of the night with a very specific audience. Yeah. And Jesus said, and also says, I said nothing in secret. Now, the word secret there occurs only once, one other time in the gospel, in chapter 7, verse 10. So that's an interesting thing, because that is actually where he was at the temple when he was preaching. John 7 was the Feast of Tabernacles, and Jesus appeared before the people when he was publicly preaching there. The word secret, though, is that Jesus traveled there in secret, so people were seeking to kill him, and of course doing so relatively privately within their own social circles, not necessarily bringing this out to public. So it's saying that Jesus went there in secret, but when he was there, he was speaking to everybody in public. And when he was speaking to everybody in public, like there were two factions in chapter 7, where one faction still wanted to kill him, and the other faction was saying, like, no, actually, he might really be the Christ. He might be the Messiah. So when Jesus is preaching in public, you actually do have this divided opinion, where some people are going more with the Pharisaical teachings, and the others are actually open. Or even with the man born blind in John 7, at the end of the third trial there in that chapter. Actually, no, sorry, at the end of the first trial with the Pharisees. The Pharisees themselves were divided, thinking, oh, well, this Jesus must be at the very least a miracle worker sent by God, not necessarily the Christ, but at least a miracle worker. And the other hand, no, he can't possibly be doing that because he healed on the Sabbath. So you have divisions every time that Jesus speaks publicly, but at least it's public, and people, if they cannot reach a consensus, they would not kill him. So he's pointing out, yeah, you brought me in secret to this place so you could have trumped up charges to kill me. Verse 21, why question me? Okay. If you're bringing somebody to trial in the ancient world, and if you're trying to convict them of their sins, would you necessarily believe the testimony that comes out of their own mouths? No, you wouldn't necessarily believe that today either. But this is why you would be reliant on the witnesses to give the testimony, not the witness himself. So Jesus is also pointing this out, where it's like, yeah, why are you questioning me about this? You should be questioning witnesses. So Jesus then directs Annas, ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. So he's saying, yeah, you should go out and get witnesses. But this is a bit of a pickle, because they haven't yet rounded up the witnesses that they need to say false things about Jesus to try and get him convicted. That happens with Caiaphas after this preliminary trial with Annas. And even then, it seems that they got witnesses kind of brought forward at the last minute, because when you look to the Gospel of Mark, Mark makes a little comment that the witnesses, when the Sanhedrin is gathered, so not just Annas, but you have the Sanhedrin with Caiaphas, and they're gathered and you have witnesses. The testimony of the witnesses didn't agree, so it seems that they just grabbed some people to be witnesses instead of being able to prepare beforehand, which seems like an oversight on their part. So there's actually an incident in the Old Testament with Naboth's vineyard. Do you remember that story?
Yep.
Well, I had some head shaking in the room. So, okay. So Naboth's vineyard happens under King Ahab in the Old Testament. So his wife is Jezebel, and she has ruined the name Jezebel for everybody else. This is why if a woman's being particularly annoying, people go, oh, she's a real Jezebel. I don't think we use that terribly much anymore. But she became synonymous with a horrible person. So what Ahaz wanted to do was he wanted this territory from his neighbor, and legally he could not gain it. So he tried to buy it from him, the guy, the fellow, Naboth, but no, I'm not doing this. This is my land. So Ahaz went back crying. Very literally, that's what the Bible says. He was crying in his bed like a little kid. And then his wife came and went like, well, man up, I'll take care of this for you. And she arranged during the feast to hire two thugs basically to sit on either side of Naboth. And then at some point during that meal, they just stood up and went, oh, blasphemed, he blasphemed. And since there were two witnesses there, he could be condemned to death. So there was a collusion beforehand to say that, yeah, there's the exact same story. But since with Jesus' trial, there were witnesses, but they could not agree on that. They didn't have time for collusion, because normally with collusion, you'd have stories that would actually agree upon each other. Now, normally, if you'd have a court case, you get a whole bunch of witnesses, and the witnesses, they have some variations within their stories because they're individuals who saw things from the individual perspectives, but they'd agree on all the main points. So if the people if we're brought against Jesus can't even agree on the main points, they might not have even been there. Yeah. Anywho, so Jesus is kind of pointing some of this stuff out with ask the people who actually heard me. But there's also one last thing that I definitely want to make sure that we see here. So Jesus says, surely they know what I said. Okay. So if somebody hears the true word of God through Jesus Christ, what might happen?
Faith.
Faith. And what is the word that appears in the Gospel of John all the time, kind of as a synonym for what we consider faith?
Believe.
Well, that's the same word in Greek. It's just faith is the noun, believe is the verb. But John has very specific vocabulary. They might something mean.
No.
To know. Yes. Yeah, because the Gospel of John all over the place uses the word to know to mean an intimate relationship, something where you are intimately connected with the person that you know. And Jesus has said that, yeah, he knows the Father knows him, and that he speaks his word, he proclaims life so that you may know him. So when Jesus is saying, surely they know what I said, he's also hinting at, yeah, the ones who have heard me, they actually believe in me. So why don't you get some of those believers down here and testify to what I said? So this makes it even more obvious when we have in the Gospel of Mark, the witnesses brought forward where they don't agree. that these are the people who haven't actually heard Jesus, because these are the people that the Pharisees and priests and scribes, that they definitely don't want testifying at Jesus' trial. They don't want believers, people who actually know Jesus, to testify, because then that would mean that they're wrong. Jesus is the Christ, and therefore they have to back him. And the little detail that that John has, this comes up at the end of chapter 11. The detail that John includes there is the Sanhedrin is worried, not because of, well, warfare with Romans, because they want to get rid of the Roman Empire from over top of them. But they're concerned that the Roman Empire will come with such force that the Sanhedrin will lose their place of authority in the land. Yeah. So rather than actually try to find Messiah, they want to make sure that they have enough military backing in order to cast off the Romans, and they don't believe that that's true at this time. So this is why the temple gets destroyed a few decades later, is because there's another revolt by some guy who's claiming that he's the Messiah, and the Jewish people back him for a long war, but the Romans still take them down. But at that time, it was better thought that they might actually win. Yeah, it was definitely a hard fought war. Like the Romans really had to contest the area. Like that war took almost 10 years to complete. So
When was
it
that
gave a
war?
lot for it, but still. Sorry,
What year was that war?
that started in 65 AD, ended in 73 AD, and then there was a few issues beyond that. But yeah, it was a long war.
Was that
Temple
when
being
the
destroyed
temple
in
was just
70 AD. Temple being destroyed.
was that when the temple was destroyed?
That's what I just said. The temple
Okay.
being destroyed in 70 AD.
Yeah, okay. I didn't hear you.
Okay. So I just kind of want to write this in. So we have a whole bunch of red, or maybe I should use red for the red flags. Use red for red flags. So just to give an idea, with the Annas trial, we have at night private residence, no Sanhedrin, no witnesses, in secret, and lack of Jesus' disciples, because he's being asked about his disciples and his teaching, and we don't have Jesus' disciples who are there. Now, John was there. Most likely he's the one who's observing this and writing it down, what he's seen. This is probably going to be different with Jesus' trial with Pontius Pilate. That's coming up shortly. Most likely John's source for that is Jesus himself. But since John was known to the high priest Annas, most likely he was able to at least observe this. Now, Peter was in the courtyard, but John was most likely front and center there. I should just put temple. Yeah, even the commentator that I was reading, he was saying like, oh yeah, well they must have gone to the temple at some point in time for the Sanhedrin trial, because otherwise this would just be illegal. Yeah.
So
But we don't have
the,
any mention of that.
so the only legit thing about the whole trial is that it was in front of Annas, the true high priest.
Yeah. And this is basically what John's trying to, well, what Jesus is pointing out, but what John really wants to highlight is, yeah, Jesus was being tried by the legitimate authority in the land, but it was not done legitimately. Jesus is showing far more honor than the legitimate authorities. Even with Pilate to a degree, Pilate is generally favorably looked upon by John. At least out of the four gospel writers, Pilate is seen in the best light. But yeah, he's still kind of going. Pilate's playing politics. I'll put it that way. He's playing politics during that back and forth. If it was up to Pilate, Pilate would have just let Jesus go and everything would be fine. Like he didn't care. But he needed to play politics. So even there, Jesus is illegitimately condemned. Yeah. I think that's. I should also just mention that, yeah, since this is highlighted where Jesus says, those who know what I said, those who believe my teachings, I'll just highlight that. Oh, wait, yeah, that was the last thing. So questioning witness directly. So we wouldn't normally have that. Like they'd ask this, but that wouldn't be the main form of evidence. So if you look to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when they have their trial of Jesus, they had all the witnesses go first. And then Caiaphas then tries to ask Jesus some very pointed questions, like, are you the Christ? So, yeah, that's after all the witnesses come forth. So Jesus then has to articulate what his position is. But when Annas is bringing this forward, basically what he's looking for is a confession. Just confess without any witnesses so we can get this done. No legitimate trial, no nothing, just do it. However, it is Jesus' own testimony that gets him condemned in the other three gospels, because when Jesus does reply there that he is the Christ, then well, not just the Christ, actually. In the other gospels, Jesus says that yes, he is the Christ, but he also calls himself the Son of Man who is coming with power upon the clouds. So Jesus is actually assuming a divine title for himself. So then they're like, oh, see, he claims to be God, we can kill him. I know all of them are witnesses to this, so then they presume that they have legitimate reason for his death. So yeah, Jesus being condemned for blasphemy, not as the Jews will later say in John's gospel, for insurrection. Now there is. Yeah. However, there's also a little bit of a divine claim here. And yeah, you wouldn't be able to see it in English, and I didn't even really notice this until the commentator Morris with the New International Commentary of the New Testament, how that he pointed this out. That Jesus is using the emphatic I. So normally for Greek verbs, you don't need a subject explicitly mentioned, because the form of the verb will tell you what the subject is, whether this is first, second, or third person, male, female, very rare cases neuter, but with the form of the verbs, that you don't necessarily need any pronoun. So if somebody's using a pronoun, then that's emphatic. So Jesus, when he says things like I am the door, or I am the good shepherd, like that's when Jesus is using emphatic pronouns, and we know that, yeah, he's trying to draw attention to this. So Jesus is actually using an emphatic I. So I have done something, and this comes up for I have spoken. I taught in the synagogues and the temple. And he says, I spoke nothing. And I'll put some extra time. Nothing in secret. So he uses the emphatic I in this speech 1, 2, 3 times. So John, when he's hearing this, he could just be trying to highlight that Jesus is using the number 3 to remind you of God. So the people who were listening to Jesus probably wouldn't even be picking this up. John might just be kind of subtly hinting at this himself. But Jesus is hinting here and there that, yeah, he is divine. He doesn't come out and say it until in front of Caiaphas with the Sanhedrin, and the trial is after this. But we have a hint of it now. Any other thoughts or questions or concerns about the statement of Jesus here? Okay, so if people
Yes,
are
I do have, if you would go back to showing online the scripture verse where he was saying, where Jesus, if I could see it for a minute, then I'll tell you.
okay.
Yeah, where he said, why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said. Now, it would depend upon if you were there to listen. What emphasis did he say? Would he have said, surely they know what I said? Or surely they know what I said? Where was the emphasis, do you think? On in that phrase, on the word they or on the word no? Or do we even have a clue?
Uh, just a moment. So as I was saying, yeah, usually there isn't a pronoun for a verb, so they would necessarily be appearing in the sentence. They does appear here. However, as I was explaining before, the word no is the important word in that clause, because the word to know in the Gospel of John is part of John's particular vocabulary. To know is to have an intimate relationship with. So the Son knows the Father knows the Son. Jesus proclaimed the Father's word to us that we may know him. So this is belief. So if Jesus is using the word know here, he's meaning it in a stronger sense than we would know, that we would have it. So yes, this is what I mean by Jesus drawing attention to the lack of his own disciples being here. So the ones who have heard Jesus would be those who have received the word of God and who have possibly become believers in him. So Jesus is pointing out, why aren't you bringing the people who have heard me? Why aren't you believing my believers and followers? If you're questioning me, about my disciples. Why aren't you gathering my disciples to testify towards my innocence?
So then if he was saying those words today, the emphasis would probably be on the word no.
I'm saying the importance is the word to know, not necessarily if he's using any emphasis in his pronunciation.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we never will know for sure, I guess, but
We could ask him,
Mhm.
but from what the text is, it is the word to know.
Thank you.
It doesn't, it doesn't really answer his question about why do you strike me? Is there some significance
Oh,
to the
yeah.
strike?
Okay, so let's get to the assault by a temple official. Okay. So when Jesus is pointing out all these things to the high priest, all the illegalities of the trial here, when Jesus said this, one of the officials who were standing nearby smacked him. Um, and even though there were far less restrictions about things back then than there are today, this still is unexpected or unlawful. Like Jesus has not been a violent criminal whatsoever. Like he was willingly walking alongside the officers. He went along with them. He even stopped Peter from going further with the sword.
And healed the servant's
Yeah.
ear.
So there's no reason to believe that he's a violent criminal. So this is just, yeah. So this should be considered unlawful. Should be. Whether or not it's accepted as such would go by the conventions at the time. In any case, also mention here that the word that comes up as like slapped, it's not necessarily slapped. It can also mean being hit with something, like you could have a rod and you could smack somebody across the, but apparently around the time of the New Testament, the primary usage was being struck with a hand. So most likely it was a slap, but we don't absolutely know for sure. It could actually be that Bart took a rod and smacked Jesus across the face.
ESV says struck, not slap.
Yep. So ESV is being more ambiguous there.
What's the word in Greek? Is it slap?
That's what I was just saying, is that there's multiple meanings in Greek. It could actually be strike with a rod, but at the time that the New Testament was being written, most likely it was slap. Okay, so yeah, we have an assault by an official, and we don't know anything about him. Now, this is interesting because Malchus was named, this guy is not named, so it could actually be that this person does not come into faith, that they just stuck with the high priest, so John doesn't really know who this guy was, he was just around there. But I just have a note here that he could actually have started a trend, because we have in the Gospel of Luke, there's a mention of, as Jesus was being brought to Caiaphas, that he was being beaten and struck multiple times. So it could be that this fellow, he started that trend, or maybe Jesus was already being beaten and he just went along with it for this particular instance. That really depends on what came first. We don't know, because Luke doesn't mention anything about Annas. But the officer's complaint is that this is an insult to the high priest. How dare you say this to the high priest? Yeah. So let's reply with Jesus. Did Jesus say anything that was wrong? No. So Jesus is saying, yeah, well, if I said anything that's wrong, well, testify about the wrong. So tell me exactly what's going on that's wrong here. Because if I spoke the truth, why did you strike me? If I'm correctly pointing out the hypocrisy of the supposedly greatest person in the land of Israel, if he is acting with hypocrisy and indignity, why are you rebuking me for his sin? And phrasing it somewhat like that, we could also say, hey, it is also the position of the suffering servant in Isaiah to take the punishment for the sins of the people. So by his stripes we are healed. So he is being punished for our mistakes. And we see a very literal example of that here. Hey, he sinned. How dare you? How dare you, Jesus?
It's a poke at the official as well, too, saying, well, this kangaroo court, you're not the judge.
Yeah.
And just go straight to punishment without hearing witnesses. And
Yeah. So you also have Jesus even pointing out this guy's sin. So Jesus has spoken the truth. So Jesus is himself exonerated by the eighth commandment, and the eighth commandment would be the one that is really going on here with the trial. So you shall not bear false witness. And that commandment is primarily for trials like this, that you would speak truthfully before God and one another, especially matters of justice. So Jesus is speaking the truth, and he's being punished for fulfilling the commandment by somebody who is breaking the commandment, specifically the fifth commandment, for his assault against Jesus' person. So it's not like the officer isn't committing murder yet, but he's acting out of the hatred of his heart against Jesus. So Jesus, when he's saying, why did you strike me if I spoke the truth? If I didn't break the eighth commandment, why are you breaking the fifth? Yeah.
I wondered why it was so cold. It turned on. It's cold.
But I forget your original question, Linda. Did I answer it?
Well, there was no response, so like is the fact that it just then Anna sends him away, is that Anna's kind of going, yeah, this guy's right, this is the way it should happen, or?
Oh, yeah. And that's one of the troubles with the Gospels themselves, because they record everything you need to know, not necessarily everything you want to know. So there could have been more words, like almost certainly there would be more words than this. But we just don't have a direct word about it. So John kind of leaves us hanging. Annas, who knows his exact position on it? Since John didn't include anything here, maybe Annas didn't try to defend himself, because verse 24, then Annas sent Jesus bound to Caiaphas. Well, that could just be a tacit omission or tacit agreement of his sin and impropriety for the trial. So even though we don't have the words of Annas, like anything that he said at this time, like he is basically admitting by handing Jesus over that this is not right. He can't really do this.
Is that why Annas sent him away to Caiaphas?
Yep, that's what I just said.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
And they said they sent him bound. So did they bind him before they sent him off, or was he already bound?
So this was a little bit of disagreement that Morris was bringing up. So Jesus was first bound in the Garden of Gethsemane. That's where we hear that he was bound.
Mm-hmm.
And I mentioned, I think a couple weeks ago when we were dealing with that passage, that this could have a very slight hint towards the binding of Isaac when Isaac was being sacrificed. So it could be trying to remind you of that. Because normally, again, yeah, you wouldn't be binding non-violent criminals, but Jesus was bound at that time. And Morris, the commentator that I was reading, was saying that normally somebody wouldn't be bound during their trial, especially again, non-violent criminals. So Jesus might have been unbound right before he went to Annas, and then he was bound again. But the actual text in verse 24 doesn't say that he was bound. It just said that like he was binded. It just said that Jesus bound. So this is a describing word. It's not a verb. So he was bound and he was sent to Caiaphas. So he could have actually been bound the entire time. I would come closer to that personally. I think that he remained bound, that they wouldn't bother try to unbind him. But there's a possibility he wasn't bound at that point in time.
Do we have any idea what that constituted, being bound? Was he just had some uh, ropes around his wrist, or what? What was being bound back then?
Well, they don't have handcuffs back then.
Mm.
Or those fancy dancy zip tie cuffs that you can. So this would most likely be rope. Most likely.
Be what?
Most likely be rope.
Rope, yeah.
The other gospels don't include the trial, the stake trial before Annas. So how does it relate to the trial before Caiaphas? Like it says it, they sent him to the high priest.
Yeah, send him to Caiaphas, the high priest.
And yet, so where does that come in the other gospels? Because
Yeah, so the other gospels don't record this aspect of it. Well, let me try to detail this.
I was just looking at Matthew and it looks like it's the
Okay.
they talk about the courtyard, it looks like it's the same location.
Oops. I'm just trying to get the. And here we go. Because I have the synopsis for people in the room so people can try and compare the gospel text. However, I don't necessarily agree with the ordering that's found in the synopsis because that requires some interpretation. So, for a timeline, we have, this isn't the right. Where is there? Oh. So we have Gethsemane. And this is where Jesus is captured, and this is where he's being sent to the high priest. So we have mention in what's called the synoptics, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So we have some mention that Jesus was sent to the house of the high priest or the palace of the high priest. Basically the same concept. And John is talking about the same. So Jesus is going to the high priest's palace. The only disagreement will be over who Jesus is standing in front of, because John's going to be the one who's mentioning Annas, the other three do not. So we also don't really get any mention of Jesus being sent terribly far. So there's some question, well, is he sent to another house, the house of Caiaphas? Is he being sent to the temple, which is kind of what commentators like Morris, the one that was keep flashing in front of the camera, that's what he would say. However, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when they're talking about high priest palace, like he's obviously not at the temple, he's not before the Sanhedrin there. So he's definitely still at a palace. But now the question is high priest palace the same for Annas and Caiaphas? Are they living in the same house?
They're both the high priest. We went through this before,
Yeah.
you know, and Caiaphas was Annas's father-in-law.
But no, you have that backwards. Caiaphas is Annas' son-in-law. Annas is the father-in-law.
Annas's father-in-law?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But Caiaphas has more authority than Annas?
Caiaphas has public authority. He was appointed by the Roman officials of that time period to be the high priest, which also means that he is not the legitimate high priest, because the high priesthood is only within the family line of Aaron, according to the oldest male. And you're in that office until you die. So if you have a living high priest and you're not his eldest son, you're not legitimately the high priest. So this is why John is bringing this out. But since Caiaphas is the public authority serving as high priest, the other gospel writers are definitely going to be featuring him. So the real question is basically, well, are they living in the same house? That's the discrepancy. And
Is that a
no
possibility?
reason to believe that they're not, especially within first century households, because it's only relatively recently that you have a family that isn't living under one roof. Like you'd have multiple generations living under one roof. It's only within the past couple centuries that this has fallen out of practice. So most likely, the high priest palace, Jesus is brought first before Annas, and then Caiaphas within that same building. And then that's when they get the Sanhedrin involved.
So the Sanhedrin come to the palace instead of them all going to the temple.
Yeah.
So it's still an illegal trial.
Yeah. It's more legal now with all of them. In the middle of the night still. But it's still an illegal trial. So most likely, he's being transferred to another part of the palace, because it's most likely, because I've seen some hypothetical reconstructions of it. So there would be multiple courtyards, multiple rooms, and so you could just be moved to a different level of that palatial estate. Yeah. So we know from John that the one with Annas is happening for the one with Caiaphas. Also, most likely what's going on is that the trial with Annas is giving Caiaphas enough time to try and gather the Sanhedrin to make this more official and public, and also to try and grab a few witnesses who saw things. Yeah. So Annas couldn't break him at the very beginning, because again, Annas does not have witnesses. He's questioning Jesus directly at the beginning rather than listening to witness testimony. He's probably just trying to get Jesus to confess something. And if Jesus isn't breaking, then Annas has to send him to Caiaphas and make sure the rest of the show gets on the road. I'm missing anything? I don't know. But part of this is also the Jesus kind of pointing some of this out with his own speech. He's showcasing that, yeah, there needs to be a more legitimate trial, which is also having as moving things along. Technically speaking, yeah, I don't think he would be part of the Sanhedrin either. But yeah, this trial isn't showcased in the Gospel of John. John doesn't really care. This also goes a little bit away from John's main theme, because John's main theme is trying to showcase the divinity of Jesus Christ, but also his lordship, his kingship, legitimacy as the ruling Messiah. So with Annas, like, yeah, that would be the legitimate authority. Caiaphas is not exactly the legitimate authority, and the trial is basically concluding that Jesus claiming to be the Son of Man. That's not really something that comes up in John's Gospel that much. So John just wants to go, yep, rejected by the legitimate Jewish authority, let's go to the legitimate Gentile authority. Yeah. Yeah, anything left with
So, so did you say that it was likely that Caiaphas and Annas resided in the same residence?
Yep, that's what I was saying.
Oh, okay.
We also don't really know how much clout Annas has over the political affairs behind the scenes either. You might want to keep this kind of in-house. Literally.
Was there a significance that Jesus was brought to Annas first?
Yes, that's John's entire point, is that he's the legitimate high priest.
Okay.
So why would the other gospels not include that trial?
Because they're going with more public stuff. Annas is the side figure, and he's the one known by John. So as earlier on in the chapter, John comments that Peter and the other disciple, they were able to get in because the other disciple is known to Annas. So John does know who he is, whereas the other disciples, they're looking more for the public trials. Yeah. Sorry, my hands are cold. Public trials. All right. So let's move along. So we're coming back to Peter. So while Jesus is in front of Annas, there's still stuff going on with Peter in the courtyard. So could somebody please read John chapter 18, verses 25 to 27?
Okay. As Simon Peter stood warming himself, he was asked, "You are not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it, saying, "I am not." One of the high priest's servants, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, challenged him. "Didn't I see you with him in the olive grove?" Again, Peter denied it, and at that moment a rooster began to crow.
Yep. Okay.
Roosters crow? Crows crow, but roosters crow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, do roosters rooster? I don't know. Crows crow. Do roosters rooster? Roosters roost.
Hens cackle.
Oh,
Rooster's a male chicken, right?
Right.
pretty much, yeah. Yeah. So, I should probably just put this in the timeline. So, most likely what's going on is that kind of going on to the side. So around the same time this is happening, we have Peter's first betrayal. So John is coming with Peter. John is going in. He's seeing what's going on with Jesus' show trial before Annas. So while he's doing that, this is where Peter is getting recognized behind him and is betraying Jesus. And then most likely as Annas is sending Jesus over to Caiaphas in the Sanhedrin, this is most likely the second betrayal that's going on in the courtyard.
Oh, the pastor.
Around the time that this is happening, or right thereafter, but around this time, this is where we're getting the third betrayal. Because this will be coming a little bit more from Luke, because Luke, when he's describing this, he gives you a bit of a time frame, because we have Peter's first betrayal, and then Luke says a little time later you have the second betrayal, and then about an hour after that, that's when you get the third. So that kind of spaces this out between the trials themselves. So while Jesus is being betrayed by the Jews in trial, Jesus is being betrayed by Peter off to the side there.
So,
Yes.
Pastor, so the three denials of Peter all happened before Christ was sent between Annas and Caiaphas?
No, that's what I'm saying is this is most likely Peter's first betrayal when he's right there with Annas. So John came into the courtyard, talked to the doorkeeper, the servant girl, got Peter to come in. John leaves. He goes to see the trial. The girl is asking Peter, "Hey, are you this guy's disciple?" Peter denies that. And there's a little bit more of a description in the other Gospels where the servant girl is kind of looking at him for a bit. So most likely that takes a little bit of time. So as John leaves, then that's when Peter is most likely alone, betraying Jesus as Annas is betraying Jesus. Then Annas sends Jesus off. Luke says, a little while after the first betrayal, Peter betrays the second time, so this is probably the interim period between the two trials. And then Luke says between the second and the third, there was about an hour. So that's either during the trial before Caiaphas or maybe shortly afterwards.
So when Christ turned and looked at him, it was when he had denied him the third time.
If I remember correctly, yes.
So there's two denials in this last section we read.
Yes.
Yeah, you're saying.
Yeah. And since John isn't covering this bit, he's doing both of those at the same time. He's not inserting the material that would normally break out. Whereas with the other three gospel writers, they're just covering this all in blocks. Matthew and Mark put this afterwards, I believe, and then Luke puts this before, or did I get that backwards? My synopses went to the other side of the room. Okay, yeah. So Matthew and Mark put the betrayals afterwards. Luke puts it before. Yes. So that's just them putting this stuff.
Rooster crow.
So I'll just grab that then.
Oh, that he's.
Yeah. So I'll also mention again that because I mentioned this in previous sessions that we've had, that John is the kindest to Peter.
Right.
So when we compare also the betrayal, John has the least to say. So he's the briefest out of all of them. And that also seems to be him just saying, "Oh yeah, this happened," instead of him giving some of the gory details. Whereas like say if you're looking at the last verse there, verse 27 for the denial, it says Peter again denied it, and at once the rooster crowed. That's not what the other gospel writers are saying. You have here in Matthew and Mark, Peter remembered how Jesus had said to him, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. It's also in Luke. Oh yeah, no, he went out and wept bitterly. Yeah, so I'm remembering something that happened before that. Sorry, with the third trial. So for the people who are in the room, I'll just put up. Sorry, who are online. People online.
That's me.
I will put up
Betty.
the text. So the text here, again, fairly sparse. So Simon Peter standing there warming himself. They asked him, who's they? The people who are in the courtyard. Who are the people in the courtyard at this time? So this would be, say, the servants of the high priest, as well as most likely a lot of the officers who had arrested Jesus and brought him here. So so there would be people with a whole bunch of weapons there looking to destroy any of Jesus' followers. Yay, that's who you want to be questioned by. They asked him, aren't you one of his disciples too? And Peter said, no, I'm not. Now, interestingly, if you look to the other Gospels, there's multiple people there, but Luke records only one person speaking. That's because probably Luke is just looking to when one of the group was speaking to him. But Matthew and Mark are talking about, the servant girl who had questioned Peter the first time around. She went and started speaking to the people who were standing there in the courtyard, and she's actually saying, I think this guy's one of his disciples. So this is also why it's only a little while in between the first and second betrayal. Is because this is the amount of time that it takes for the servant girl to go around and start sowing these seeds. So the bystanders are going, hi, this guy was with him. Whereas Peter then decides, no, I'm not that guy. So John is just kind of taking the collective, all of the people are saying this. And Luke, when he's just mentioning one guy, it's most likely that Peter is being questioned time and time again by a whole mess of people. So the second betrayal is most likely not just Peter denying, say, this coming up one time or with one person. He's probably just going to a whole group of people saying continuously, no, I don't know, no, I don't know, and stop this.
Well, didn't he just say, didn't he just deny him 3 times, not multiple times?
Well, this is what I'm saying. The second denial is actually to a whole group of people. So Peter is most likely saying it to the whole group of people, which would be multiple times in the second denial. Yeah.
So the first time he was denying just to one person. The second time,
he was denying it to the servant girl.
Yeah, and then the second time, it's kind of clear that he's
all the people the servant girl was speaking to.
Yeah, and then the third time?
The second time was around the fire.
Yeah. So Peter was, it says here, warming himself.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, he's just standing there in the courtyard.
Doesn't say he heard, at least in John, that he heard the rooster crow after the servant girl pointed him out.
No, it's only after the third time that the rooster crows. So because what Jesus had prophesied was that before the rooster crows, you'll deny me 3 times.
Oh, so it'll just be once then.
Yeah.
Was there any indication in any of the Gospels that rooster crowed after each denial or just after the third?
When Jesus says, you will deny me 3 times before the rooster crows, it's before the rooster crows, you are going to deny me the whole 3 times.
Okay.
Okay. So meanwhile, yeah, Peter's doing this. You have a whole crowd that's now coming at him. And most likely they're all trying to say you're one with him. So within the 4 gospels, there's differences between how this is being phrased. So Matthew has, this man was with Jesus of Nazareth. Mark has, this man is one of them. And Luke has only one person saying, you also are one of them. So most likely, yeah, there's a whole group of people speaking this, because John also says, you aren't one of his disciples too, are you? So it's an actual question. So most likely, whole group of people, and they're all kind of pointing this out. So Peter has to deny it to a whole group of people. But eventually, one would assume, things quiet down. Because, yeah, this is where Luke says, and after an interval of about an hour, so an hour in between the second and third denial, there was still another still another insisted saying, and yeah, all of them are kind of consistent in this. And all 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are fairly consistent in how they're phrasing this, but John gives us something a little bit different. So John, who has more intimate knowledge of what's going on specifically with Peter in this situation, he's saying one of the high priest's servants, so a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, so most likely this man is also an officer, because he's also saying, didn't I see you with him in the garden? So most likely this guy was there at Jesus Christ's arrest. The guy would also have a reason to remember Peter's face. Like the other disciples, they might have been cowering in the background, but Peter was the one who stepped out to cut off Malchus's ear. So the guy who was looking after his relative, we don't really know how close a relative he is. Like the actual word being used is kinsman, so he could be like within the same family tree. So he might have been cousin or something. We don't know. But kinsman of the man whose ear Peter cut off, like he just sees his cousin. Again, we don't know how close, but cousin's ear being chopped off by this guy. You're probably going to remember that guy's face. So he goes, didn't I see you with him in the garden? With Jesus in the garden? So John gives us that detail. Whereas the other gospel writers, when they're looking to the third denial, they're mentioning, hey, aren't you one of Jesus' disciples, because your accent is from Galilee? So as with differences between the gospels, this isn't a contradiction. It's most like it's just a difference. So the questioner is going to be this fellow, the relative of Malchus. And he says, didn't I see you with him in the garden? Peter says something to the effect of, no, you didn't see me there. I wasn't there. Then the guy could have just heard that and went, oh, well, that's a Galilean accent. So are you sure that you weren't there? And Peter, like in the other gospels too, it says that after this person questioned him, he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear. So that implies that this whoever's questioned him in this third time, he's relatively persistent. So yeah, it could have been not only didn't I see you in the garden, but it could have also been, well, you must have been his disciple because you're a Galilean. So they're most likely the 2 statements, even though John only gives us 1. But when you think about it, if John is giving us the tidbit that this is Malchus's cousin or kinsman, and the other gospel writers don't remotely talk about Malchus, then why would they say that this is the relative of so and so? Why would they go with that? If they're not giving the background details, why would they go with this particular question? Didn't I see you in the garden? That's a very particular question. So most likely they're trying to grasp onto something else that was happening at the time. Especially if this is in accordance with the theory that we're trying to protect Peter's identity and Malchus's identity. Because again, John was the only one who mentions that it was Peter who cut off Malchus's ear, and that it was Malchus whose ear got cut off. John is the only one who mentions names. So if the other gospel writers were trying to protect identities because Peter could still be arrested, tried, and killed for this, then why would they draw attention suddenly to Peter being the guy who did this? Because the other gospel writers would still try to be protecting his identity.
So,
We can include this question. We'll include the other part of it.
so which gospel at this point points out that Jesus turned and looked at Peter?
Luke was it? Second or third one?
Was it Matthew? Or Luke? Or
I'm trying
and
to
then he went out and cried bitterly. Where's that one?
Well, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke who said that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm trying to find it.
Yeah, Luke.
Luke?
The,
Oh yeah. Luke 61.
the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered the word, the prophecy.
Yeah. So yeah, that would probably be sometime around the third trial. So most likely when it's not just the courtyard, but Jesus getting closer
Was
to
that a
the
door
courtyard.
chime?
I think it was.
It's pretty cool.
Mm. Okay. So again, yes. Peter's being the nicest, John's being the nicest to Peter. So we don't have Peter's denial, including that he cursed and stomped his feet and saying, "No, I don't know him at all. I don't know Jesus." So yeah, John just leaves that. Again, Peter denied it in that moment. Rooster began to crow.
Luke also said that Jesus turned and looked at Peter.
Yep.
When the rooster crowed. Make him feel even worse.
So the last little bit of this is roosters are only mentioned 6 times in this gospel, and it is either the prediction of the betrayal or the actual betrayal. In the New Testament, roosters are only mentioned in the Gospels, in the prediction of the betrayal and the betrayal. So there's no significance of roosters outside of this. Like we don't hear about them. So if there's anything else to put in, like to read into the text about a rooster, I can't find it. I don't. So it could just be that this is just the thing that happened, and Jesus said, "Look at that."
Well, it would be another thing indicating that it was now morning. Because roosters crow in the morning.
Right.
Right?
Well, that's the tradition, but not necessarily. Because I've also heard from farmers that, like, yeah, roosters just crow.
Town, that's one of the things they don't want roosters because it wakes them up, in the city.
Yeah, but it could also be that they're crowing before daylight or after daylight.
They're not
At dawn. At dawn.
Like I remember a hotel in Cambodia that I started eating chicken almost exclusively when it came to meals because outside of the hotel where we were staying, there was somebody was keeping a rooster and he wouldn't shut up. I was being very petty at that time. However, sadly, when I actually did see the rooster, because I had no idea where it was, when I actually did see the rooster, it was the day that we were leaving that hotel. Yeah, it was being kept under kind of a wooden cage, and it was just cooped up there. And I understand why you're mad now. Can't hate you anymore. Poor thing there. I don't like you for waking me up, but you know. I mean, yeah, he was loud at other times of the day too.
But maybe there's a purpose about this rooster crowing. Jesus predicted it, of course, because he knew, but it also would bring to Peter a very quick connection to a memory of what Jesus had said and predicted. You
Yeah.
know,
So, anyways, I can't find anything related to rooster because rooster is always connected with this event. But the word for crowed, it doesn't just mean that a bird makes sound. It's yeah, kind of a call or cry out. So this occurs a few times in the gospel, John's gospel. So it's about so there appears with the immediate glorification of the Son by the Father. So this is so in the washing of the feet, Jesus also predicts Judas's betrayal. Judas goes out, and then Jesus crows by saying, now the Son is glorified by the Father. Now has the hour come. So we have that. We also have this.
the same word.
Hey, yeah,
Is that the same word, the same Greek word?
yes, the same Greek word is what I'm saying. Verse. Oh, yeah. Sorry, I have to check something. I have something in my notes that doesn't quite make sense to me. I think I might have gotten the first number wrong. Just a moment. But I'm looking again for this specific word. Actually, I should have kept in John 18 and just grabbed that word. But the word in general is phoneko, to call or cry out. That we have. So I think there's oh, that makes more sense. Yeah, okay. Oh, that's not the word I'm looking at.
Okay.
Yeah, because there is a connection with Jesus and the betrayal. However, I was not the crowing. Because in my notes I just put the use of the word immediately sparked some attention, and I misread myself. So
Oh dear.
it's the use of the word, which is immediately. The word immediately sparked some attention. Oh, sorry for being an idiot. Okay. So the word immediately only comes up in John's gospel 6 times. There we go. This is the word that's really important. Okay. So the immediacy is with Judas being immediately going out into the night. Immediately is Jesus immediately being glorified by the Father as soon as Judas heads out in the night. Immediately is the blood and water gushing out of Jesus Christ's side with the spear wound. Yeah, so together with this immediate crow of the rooster, these 4 uses out of the 6 point us to remember Christ's death for our salvation. So even though Peter is very despondent over the rooster crowing and him being betrayed, like the John is still kind of pointing, hey, this has something else going on here. There's the yes, the immediacy of the betrayal, similar to how Judas immediately went out into the night to betray Jesus, but there's still the immediacy of the glorification of Jesus for those who are sinners. So there's yet hope for Peter.
John doesn't use the word immediately for the rooster.
Yes, he does.
He does?
Yep.
I didn't hear that.
At that moment, yes.
Just
Euthios.
verse 27.
Yep.
Peter again denied it, and at once the rooster crowed. Well,
At once.
but
Immediately.
not- Yeah.
That's after the third denial.
So that's the word immediately.
And I think he uses at that moment.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I thought you were actually meaning the word immediate when you said it. Maybe it comes up too, I don't know.
No, that's that word right there, is at once is being translated from the word in Greek for immediately. It's one of the characteristic features of the Gospel of Mark, so it doesn't really come up as much in the other Gospel writers, but Mark uses immediately all the time, because everything immediately happens after everything else. Even after you read some of the other Gospels and realize, oh, well, this immediately happened, but it was actually like 2 months later or something. Mark just really likes to move the story forward, is basically the thing. Because when you read John, you realize that Jesus' ministry takes about 3 years, but if you read Mark, you might just, like, if you only read Mark, you might assume it took like 3 months, and that's about. Because Mark just, this and then this and then this and then. Okay. So sorry about that. I misread my notes. So is there anything else with the betrayals of Peter and the trial of Annas? Anything else for that?
So my question is, those 3 denials, I think they must have occurred. I don't think Peter left the courtyard, do you?
There's no mention of him doing so, so I doubt it. At least
So-
not this time.
So in other words, those 3 denials happened at that residence,
Yep.
Annas's residence.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I always,
the first and the second would definitely have to have been if, like, even in the other gospel writers, like they're basically saying it has to have occurred because the person who asked Peter the first time was the one who sparked the crowds for the second time, so she had to have been there. Within John's gospel, he's definitely situated in the exact same location, and the exact same location with the person who is involved with the arrest of Jesus, who brought Jesus to that restaurant. So it has to be there.
so I don't know. I think I always imagined that the third denial was when Jesus was being taken away. Like
Well, that
like
depends exactly like when these two things are happening.
Was he on his way to Pontius Pilate or Herod or
We
no,
don't know
not here.
exactly because we don't have a timestamp.
Okay.
But sometime around the condemnation of Jesus with Caiaphas, Peter was condemning Jesus, betraying him.
So the idea that Annas and Caiaphas were in the same residence is likely?
Extremely so, yes.
Oh, okay. Okay. So the first two denials, Peter probably wasn't within the sight of Jesus.
Well, he's in the courtyard, so I really doubt the courtyard would have been in sight of
What was
Anna's
going on?
private room.
Yeah.
Whereas for the Sanhedrin show trial, that would have been a little bit more public. So not necessarily that wouldn't really be in a courtyard, but that would be probably closer to one.
Okay.
And Luke says, Peter remembered the word of the Lord. Before the cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times. And he went out and wept bitterly. So at that point, Peter went out.
Yeah. Well, he needs to exit that structure eventually because he also has to be one of the witnesses of the crucifixion, so he has to eventually get there.
Yeah.
We lose track of the disciples after this, though. We don't know exactly where any of them are. But Jesus then gets sent over to Pontius Pilate. There's also the incident with Herod. So where the disciples are around there, we don't know. We don't have an explicit word, but yeah. So yeah, this is the last word we have of one of their whereabouts, and until basically Sunday morning.
Well,
with the exception of John at the crucifixion.
right.
John is explicitly mentioned there. We don't have an explicit mention of where they are until Sunday morning. Most likely they're all there watching the crucifixion.
Would Peter be fearing for his own life? Is that why he's denying Jesus?
Sure. He wasn't fearing for his own life, and he was willing to go die by the sword. So it's an odd thing to see the shift in him. Last week when we were talking about the first betrayal, this is why I was trying to highlight that this was from the servant girl. So she would have been relatively young. She would have been somebody low status and a slave, a Jewish slave. So she would have far more rights than any Roman slave, but still a slave, relatively young, and a doorkeeper. So just doing menial tasks in the household. She asked him, even though like there were armed guards ready to take Jesus, and Peter was ready there to swing the sword, but with this little girl who's off to the side, and she just asked him casually, like, "What are you one of his disciples?" And then Peter just kind of breaks. So as I was saying, like, there's the temptation, like you build yourselves up for the big fight, but when the small temptations come, you're not necessarily prepared. You're more easy. Yeah, it's easier for you to fall. Easier to fall.
Slippery slope.
Well, that's that too. Because, let's say for example, no, maybe I shouldn't use this example. I don't know, it's the only one I'm thinking of. Okay, fine, I'm using the example. Okay. So let's say you are going to church and you go outside, maybe it's also on Pandora Avenue, and somebody's hanging out there and somebody says, hey, do you want to have sex with me for some money? And you're like, no, I'm not going to break the sixth commandment. Why would I do that? And you're very much prepared if somebody tries to proposition you that way to deny things, to do that. But let's say you have a long-standing relationship with somebody, you get to know them very well, you share many interests over years, and then that person after many years says, hey, let's have sex before marriage. Maybe not phrasing exactly that way, maybe in a more romantic fashion. But somebody says that, you'd be far more likely to fall into that trap and break the sixth commandment, like having sex outside of marriage, than you would with just somebody propositioning you on the street. But in either case, the same sin is being broken, but it's far more subtle in the one than the other. Stupid devil knowing the chinks in our armor. If there are no more comments or questions, I think we can actually end here for today.
That's more than one verse.
Which is good because I haven't printed out my notes for the next section yet. Okay, let us pray. Dear Lord, Heavenly Father, thank you for giving us your dear Son, Jesus Christ, that he might go to trial and death for our sins, that we might be saved, well, from separating ourselves from you. You, O Lord, were betrayed by the Jews as well as the disciples, abandoned by them, yet you still called them to be your servants, so that through faith they might have their sins forgiven. We ask you, O Lord, that as we struggle with sin in this world, that you continue to be with us, continue strengthening us through your word, that we may do what is good and right, and when we do slip and fall into sin, that you forgive our sins and bring us into the righteousness of Christ. In his name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Pastor.
Amen.